On the night of October 26, 2013, short distress pulses were detected several times from deep within the Prescott National Forest. Too weak to be classified as an SOS, but too regular to be a coincidence. 2 years later, in an abandoned quarry near Sailor Springs, a decaying tent and human bones were found under a layer of rubble, which had been moved by someone at least twice. Experts have named the man Paul Reynolds. The forest was silent, but the traces led to a man who knew it as well as the man who died there. In early October of 2013, the Prescott National Forest was entering the season of early cold. The days were still warm, but the nights were getting sharper, and the wind coming down from Granite Mountain carried the dry smell of stone and old pine needles. It was during this period that a 32-year-old architect from Phoenix, Paul Reynolds, decided to spend a weekend alone hiking part of the Willow Creek Trail. According to his colleagues, he had long been planning a short escape from the city's rhythm and chose a route that he considered safe and well-marked. According to the mobile operator, the last activity of his phone was recorded on Friday evening during a short conversation with a friend that lasted less than 10 minutes. In it, Paul said that he was already in the Prescott area and was going to camp for the night near the bottom of the trail. The friend's note, provided to investigators later, stated, "He sounded calm, said he would be in touch on Saturday afternoon if he had a stable signal." On Sunday, Paul did not show up for work, did not answer his phone, and his colleagues, knowing his punctuality, contacted the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office. An official report of the disappearance was registered the next morning, after which the first checks of the possible route began. Rangers noted that the weather conditions were stable: low winds, dry air, no precipitation, that is, nothing that could cause an immediate emergency for an experienced hiker. By lunchtime, groups of volunteers from Prescott Mountain Rescue and dog handlers were gathered. The search began from the lower section of the Willow Creek Trail, focusing not only on the official route, but also on the subtle side branches used by hunters and experienced hikers. After several hours of traveling, the dogs were able to pick up the original trail, but it broke off several hundred yards from the trailhead. The dog handlers noted in the report that the scent was mixed with numerous extraneous tracks, which meant that Paul was walking through an area where many people were passing through in those days. By sunset, the rangers had made a complete detour of the main route. The report states that no signs of an overnight stay were found. No fires, no traces of decomposed equipment, no characteristic dents in the grass or between pine needles. Investigators emphasized one more detail. On the stretch between Willow Creek Trail and the lower approaches to Granite Mountain, there are no places where you can easily get off the trail without being seen by other hikers. However, Paul's actual direction of travel remained uncertain. He had left no landmarks, and mobile phone coverage in the area was unstable. On the evening of the first day of the search, a county helicopter was dispatched to survey the area within a few miles of the initial trailhead. The pilot reported that no lights, movement, or heat signatures were detected that might indicate human presence. The forest at this time of year is particularly dense in the lower areas, and the aerial view covers no more than a third of the area where the missing person could be. On the second day, the search was expanded to the upper sections of the Granite Mountain ascent. There, the groups found several old tracks from hiking boots, but experts confirmed that they belonged to older hikers. Even a short rain the day before, which barely moistened the topsoil, could have destroyed the fresh prints. At the end of the day, no items had been found that could be identified as belonging to Paul. Colleagues with whom he had worked on a recent architectural project provided investigators with brief written statements. One of them said, "Paul didn't make spontaneous decisions. He always planned his route, always returned on time." This was an additional argument for the search to continue without pause. The 24th hour after the disappearance was considered critical, but the situation did not show any landmarks, even to build a probable line of travel. On the third day, the teams expanded the search to areas marked as impassable. These areas were characterized by rocky ridges, sparse stands of yucca and juniper, and narrow passages between boulders. Only those who were deliberately looking for an isolated route could have ended up there. However, even there, the experts found no signs of fresh human presence. After almost 30 hours of work in the field, the search coordinator noted in his memo, "There is insufficient data to determine the direction of the missing person's movement. It is recommended to involve experts in mapping analysis and recheck the initial sections of the route." This meant that the existing trail had effectively disappeared, and no signs that could help establish Paul Reynolds's further movement appeared. By the end of the week, the ranger reports included the wording that often accompanies such cases when there are no alarms or witnesses: probable disappearance with no obvious signs of injury. However, his friend, who was the first to request help, emphasized in a conversation with investigators, it was impossible for him to disappear just like that. He would have found a way to tell us if something happened. It was this phrase that became the basis for continuing the search indefinitely. Prescott's Forest did not provide any answers at that time, and even indirect traces did not hint at where to look next. Paul Reynolds was officially reported missing in the mountainous area without established circumstances, and the search teams temporarily suspended the operation, waiting for new information, which at that time was not available at all. In early October of 2015, an abandoned quarry near Sailor Springs, once used for granite mining, had long since become overgrown with brush and a training ground for geology students from a local college. According to the official practice schedule, they were to conduct a series of measurements of landslides and collect sediment samples for laboratory analysis. The site was deemed relatively safe: shallow sinkholes, low slopes, and no active cracks. However, it was one of these shallow excavations, marked on the map as excavation number 3, that became the point that changed the status of Paul Reynolds's case. The students arrived at the site in the morning, when the sun had not yet risen above the upper hilltops. According to the teacher who led the group, they split into small teams of 2. Some worked with tools, others took measurements and photographed the sediments. Around noon, one of the students, analyzing the angle of a stone wall, noticed a dark piece of material sticking out from under a layer of fine gravel. At first, he assumed it was a torn piece of old film or tarpaulin that used to cover the equipment. But when he tried to gently move a few of the top stones, a rounded, light-colored shape that did not resemble any geological specimen emerged from beneath them. The teacher wrote in his memo, "A student reported an object that looked like a bone structure. It was decided to stop work immediately and notify the sheriff's office. A Yavapai County task force was dispatched to the scene. An initial inspection confirmed that the shallow depression, which was partially covered by the landslide, did indeed contain human remains wrapped in an old nylon tarpaulin that had crumbled in some places when touched. The experts from the forensic department took their time. They photographed every stone and every layer of debris before moving on. The quarry, despite its outward openness, knows how to hide things for a long time. According to the expert who arrived at the site, the structure of the stone stacking indicated repeated movement. This meant that the body did not get here naturally and was not accidentally buried under the scree. After removing the tent and bone fragments, all the materials were sent to a laboratory in Prescott. The preliminary conclusion was that the skeleton belonged to an adult male. The condition of the decomposition was difficult to assess accurately, but on the spot, experts said that the bones had spent a significant period in the open air, but the tent itself additionally protected them from precipitation and animals. Official identification came a few days later. Dental records obtained from a dental clinic in Phoenix matched. The report stated, "Identified, Paul Reynolds, a resident of Phoenix, reported missing in October 2013. This was the formal moment of reclassification of the case. A new entry was made in the sheriff's log. Status: probable intentional taking of life. It is necessary to establish the place of initial death and the circumstances of the body's movement. In parallel with the identification, the investigation of the quarry itself began. Experts examined the composition of the crushed stone in detail. The internal report of one of the groups stated that the top layer was relatively fresh, meaning that the collapse could have occurred after the body was left there. But the lower layers, closer to the tent preparation, showed signs of manual intervention. Several stones were lying in an unstable configuration that is not typical of natural scree. One of the students who observed the process later testified, "I saw that the stones under the tent seemed to be stacked on purpose. They didn't look like they had just fallen down." The sheriff's office invited an additional team of forensic scientists who specialize in grave site investigations. They conducted a full topographic survey and concluded that the tent with the body was too close to the surface for the perpetrator to have intended to hide it for long. A team member commented in the report, "The depth of the dive was shallow. Either the burial was done in a hurry, or this is the second place where the body was moved." The second option immediately became a priority, as natural erosion could not have changed the gravel layer in such a specific way over 2 years. During the additional examination, several small artifacts were found: a fragment of polymer fiber rope, a tiny fragment of green fabric, and a small shard covered with a blue coating of unknown origin. Each of them was sent for examination separately. At this stage, the experts avoided any conclusions, noting only the possibility of external coloration not characteristic of natural processes. The students who discovered the body gave official statements. One of them said, "We didn't notice anything strange in the morning light, but when the sun rose higher, something that looked like a bone shone in the awning." Another added, "There was almost no smell. It was as if everything had been in a dry place for a long time." In the evening of the same day, Prescott held a short press briefing. The spokesperson confirmed the discovery of the remains, emphasizing that the investigation was considering the incompatibility of natural causes with the nature of the material found. All other details were classified as the quarry was declared a potential crime scene. After Paul Reynolds was officially identified, investigators reopened his case as an active investigation. One of the first decisions was to study possible routes that the attacker could have used to get to the quarry. The location required special transportation or knowledge of dirt roads that had not been listed in official registers for a long time. The quarry was not a random spot. It was off the beaten path, but close to technical trails used by construction and forestry crews. The case file, added after the reactivation, states, The body was brought here by a person or group of people with access to heavy equipment or specialized routes. At this stage, the investigation focused on the fact that the death did not occur in the quarry, and the body itself was moved to it after an unidentified event that had occurred earlier. A separate group of experts examined the nylon tent. They found that it had been lying outdoors for a long time, but had clear signs of being rolled up and re-rolled out. This again pointed to a possible double movement of the remains. The condition of the molecular fibers led to a preliminary conclusion that the tarpaulin had been subjected to strong pressure or overload, possibly during transportation. The report prepared after the initial examination ended with the following statement: "The manner in which the body was concealed indicates a deliberate act. The nature of the concealment is not consistent with an accidental burial. Further investigation required establishing who had access to the quarry during the relevant period and whether the site could have been used more than once." At the time of October 2015, all of these questions remained open. After the official identification of Paul Reynolds's remains, the case was taken over by Detective Mark Vargas of the Yavapai County Sheriff's Department. Vargas had worked in the Violent Crimes Unit for nearly a decade and had a reputation for rarely jumping to conclusions. His approach was different in that he did not start with theories, but with material details, even if they seemed minor. It was these details that determined the first direction of the investigation. The first full report from the lab came to the Sheriff's Department on the third day after the remains were recovered. The expert's accompanying note stated, "On one of the pelvic bones, microparticles of a coating of artificial origin were found, probably paint. The color is dark, closer to blue." Vargas reviewed the list of equipment that Paul wore on his hiking trips: a standard set of clothes, a backpack, a lightweight tent, and hiking boots. None of these items had mirrored or painted elements in the appropriate color. Vargas made a brief note in his official report: "The foreign coating does not match the victim's equipment. The source must be identified." This was the first warning sign. The paint on the bone could only have appeared through contact with a foreign object, a surface, a tool, a piece of equipment, or an item of inventory. Experts explained that the microparticles are in the nature of fibers formed by impact or abrasion contact. This reduced the likelihood of accidental paint ingress during natural processes. The second key point was the conclusion of the forensic team regarding the time of movement of the body. The analysis of the bones and the structure of the tent showed that death occurred much earlier than the moment when the body was in the quarry. The document stated, "The degree of tissue decomposition and the nature of the damage to the tarp indicate that the remains had been exposed to a different environment for a long time before being placed in the quarry." One of the experts suggested that this period could have been several months, although the exact duration cannot be determined due to the partial degradation of the tissues. This conclusion changed the context of the entire case. The Kyiv Quarry was not the place of death, but the second or even third place where the body was moved after death. This was not a sign of panic, but of a thoughtful decision that took time, transportation, and a minimum of witnesses. In his internal report, Vargas noted, "The case is classified as a premeditated act. There is a movement of bodily remains after death. The nature of the actions indicates caution and knowledge of the area." The next step of the detective was to study the quarry as a potential waypoint. He personally traveled to the site with forensic experts to assess access. The inspection showed that there were several ways to enter the quarry: an official road that had not been maintained for a long time, and several dirt trails that were not listed in state registers. local fishermen and hunters confirmed that these trails are used only by those who know the forest well or by crews that have worked there in previous years. During the survey, Vargas noticed another detail. On the northwestern wall of the quarry, there were fresh marks from repeated movements of the stone mass. The geologist's report noted that artificial landslides in this area are only noticeable because the soil has a different color and texture. The stone in the place where the tent was found did not shift naturally. It was moved manually or with the use of tools. This only reinforced the assumption that the remains had been moved much later than the time of death. Vargas requested a second analysis of the tent, this time focusing on molecular fibers. The second examination confirmed that the surface showed signs of repeated folding, compression, and unfolding. This could have meant transportation in a confined space, or an attempt to conceal the body in other ways before delivery to the quarry. The detective began to study the map of forestry operations for the period after Paul's disappearance. The Forest Service provided information about teams that had permits for technical work in the region. Vargas studied the routes for which temporary permits were issued, building forest roads, clearing areas after storms, and maintaining trails. Many of these works were performed by private companies, which meant that any of their employees could have access to remote areas. At the same time, experts continued to investigate the paint coating found on the pelvic bone. The laboratory report indicated that the particles belonged to a group of specialized coatings used in industrial environments or for painting heavy machinery. Although it was not possible to pinpoint the manufacturer or the area of application at this stage, experts emphasized that such paint is rarely found in household products. With this in mind, Vargas expanded the list of possible suspects to include those who work with machinery, forestry machine operators, repairmen, construction company employees, and private crew owners. He requested information from local auto repair shops and warehouses about people who had purchased dark-colored paint materials in recent years. At this stage, the investigation had no names, but the overall picture was becoming clearer. Those who worked in the forest had access to equipment, knew the local routes, and could remain invisible. An additional expert opinion was issued at the end of the week. The document stated, "There are no signs of natural death. The secondary displacement indicates the intentional actions of an unidentified person." It was this conclusion that Detective Vargas used to initiate an extensive background check of everyone who worked in the woods in the period following Paul Reynolds' disappearance. At this point, the investigation was beginning to go beyond a standard missing persons case. The detective had evidence of foreign material on the bones, evidence of repeated movement of the remains, and confirmation that the body had been in a location that had yet to be determined. All of these factors pointed to one thing. This was not a chaotic crime or an accident. He was looking at the work of a person who knew the forest, knew its routes, and was confident enough to hide the body not just once, but several times. The crime lab report, which arrived at the sheriff's department in late October, contained a conclusion that set a new direction for the investigation. At the top of the document, the experts stated that the coating particles found on Paul Reynolds' pelvic bone belonged to a specialized type of paint known as Ford Tractor Blue. This coating is used for heavy equipment, off-road vehicles, and large-sized machines that operate in difficult conditions. Chemical analysis confirmed the fiber's resistance to UV and mechanical abrasion, a characteristic inherent only in industrial products. The forensic report stated that the likelihood of accidental contact with this type of coating in a domestic environment is extremely low. This meant that either Paul had come into contact with appliances painted with this compound, or his body had touched such a surface after his death. Detective Mark Vargas drew attention to the latter point because the bone structure was affected in a part that rarely comes into contact with machine parts during normal tourist travel. Vargas initiated an additional survey of auto repair shops and parts stores in Prescott and the surrounding area. The task was simple: find out who might have purchased this type of paint in recent years. Although there were sometimes no documentary records, the detective relied on the memory of those who work with regular customers and specific products. The first point was the Prescott Auto Parts Store. It was a small room with metal shelves where cans of paint for industrial vehicles stood next to filters for engines. An employee who had worked there for many years agreed to testify. He said that 2 years ago, in the spring, a man came into the store and bought a can of paint identical to the one identified by the experts. According to the employee, the man was not a regular customer, but appeared in the store several times during one warm season. The description given in the official protocol was vague: middle-aged, light beard, work clothes, worn jacket with dark inserts. The employee particularly remembered the smell of grease and wood dust coming from him, a sign that he had been doing physical work in open areas. In his report, Vargas wrote down the employee's words verbatim. He said he needed to paint the bumper of the pickup truck. He added that the truck was old and so was the equipment. He mentioned that he was working in the woods at a construction site. These words were the first hint of the man's profession, which could be connected to the paint traces. Forestry construction crews working in remote areas of Prescott had a large number of heavy machinery that often suffered mechanical damage and needed periodic repainting. Such crews could have access to specific routes and deserted areas where strangers rarely appeared. Vargas consulted a registry of temporary permits that were commonly granted to private companies to work in the Prescott National Forest. Most of the permits were for fire breaks, clearing small roads, installing drainage systems, and engineering work. The detective began to work through the records from the time of Paul's disappearance until the following spring, hoping to find people who had worked in the same area where the little-known trails might have remained. At the same time, he returned to the paint sample itself. Forensic scientists found that the particles had a non-standard pigment ratio, which is typical of only certain batches of industrial paint. This meant that the paint could have been purchased not in a regular store, but in a workshop or warehouse that handles large volumes. Vargas suggested that this could be one of the technical bases that supply materials for the construction of forest roads. The forensic report had an additional note. The nature of the abrasive damage on the particles indicates impact contact. It is likely that the body came into contact with a surface that had been mechanically impacted or damaged earlier. This led the detective to consider the possibility that at the time of his death, Paul was near machinery or an object used in forestry operations. Vargas then began to drive around to other auto repair shops. In 2 of the shops, employees did not recall anything similar, but in one of them, a mechanic who worked with older pickup trucks confirmed that he had seen similar paint on several vehicles belonging to contractors working on forest roads. According to him, some crews bought the paint in bulk because they had to patch frames and bumpers after difficult seasons. Such circumstantial evidence could apply to anyone, but Vargas emphasized in the report, the common element is working in the forest and using equipment painted in a dark industrial color. He also recorded information from an employee who mentioned a man with a pickup truck. Came by often, looked like he was working longer than the season, and talked about construction work. This multiplicity of small details, local work, knowledge of forest routes, an old pickup truck, a need for paint, began to form a circle in the center of which could be the person involved in the movement of Paul Reynolds's body. Vargas decided to compile a list of all the crews that had performed work at the time. He was given a preliminary list of companies, some of which were too small to keep detailed records. These were the kind of crews that could hire workers without formal contracts. In the evening, Vargas conducted additional analysis of the testimony of the Prescott Auto Parts store employee. He noticed the timing. The man had bought paint in the spring, long after Paul had disappeared. This ruled out the scenario of a coincidence. If we assume that the paint on the bones occurred after death, then the paint could have gotten on the body during transportation or concealment. In addition, the fact that the employee remembered a specific industrial smell from the man was consistent with the characteristics of those who work with machinery or heavy machinery. The detective began to analyze the routes of delivery of materials to the forest. Such routes often pass through places where there are no tourists and only drivers, workers, or those who know old field roads can remain invisible. This allowed the offender to move with the cargo without the risk of being noticed. The experts provided an additional conclusion about the structure of the paint. A specific composition inherent only in the models of Ford vehicles used at the construction site. This fact opened up a new hypothesis. The person could have had an old pickup truck, equipment, or trailer painted in this particular shade. Vargas noted this in a memo as a potential starting point for vehicle identification. All of the data collected provided only subtle but concrete hints. Whoever had access to the Ford Tractor blue paint was working in the woods, repairing equipment, and traveling on roads that were not on official maps. Vargas realized that this trail was the first real direction that could lead to the person who knew much more about Paul's death than anyone else. Detective Mark Vargas received confirmation from forensic experts that the paint on Paul Reynolds's bones belonged to an industrial series used on heavy machinery. This narrowed down the search. Only companies that worked in the Prescott National Forest during the period of Paul's disappearance could have had access to such material. Vargas made a formal request to the Forest Service for permits for logging, forest road repairs, and any maintenance work that was issued at the time. In response, he received a list of private contractors, among which a small company called Black Mesa Logistics stood out. The forestry documents indicated that this company had been working for several seasons to build temporary roads and clear hard-to-reach areas. The advantage of this company was that it worked where official routes were unsuitable for heavy machinery. This meant that its employees knew hidden entrances, little-known forest exits, and points where equipment could work without prying eyes. Vargas decided to visit the company's office. It was located on the outskirts of Prescott, an old metal building with several tool containers, nearby warehouses, and a parking lot for vehicles. According to the administrator, the company performed most of the work under seasonal contracts, and the staff changed almost every year. However, the documents contained a name that caught the detective's attention: Harry Jenkins. Harry worked for Black Mesa Lodgings during the period of interest. According to the company's records, he owned an old Ford pickup truck, the model that was most often painted in a shade that matched the forensic evidence. The administrator confirmed that in the spring of that year, Jenkins repaired his own vehicle and brought empty paint cans to the office to be disposed of with technical waste. The internal police record also indicated that Jenkins had one misdemeanor offense in his past: assault without a weapon. Although not a serious offense, it warranted additional scrutiny. Vargas invited him to the police station for an interview. Jenkins's testimony was concise. He claimed that he did not know Paul Reynolds and did not work in the Willow Creek Trail area at the time of his disappearance. According to him, he was working on another project that fall, building a road in the eastern part of the forest. When asked about the paint, he said that he did paint the pickup, but only for his own use. Jenkins also explained that he did not perform any work near the quarry near Sailor Springs. The interview report states, "The interviewee insisted that he had no connection to Reynolds, had not seen him, and had not been in the area of the alleged disappearance." Vargas, however, noted several points that needed further verification. First, there was no official confirmation that Jenkins worked at the location in question in the fall. At that time, some of the work was performed without detailed documentation, and records of equipment movements were fragmentary. Secondly, his pickup truck, although old, was of the model that often had to be repainted due to corrosion and mechanical damage from forest roads. Third, Vargas noted a behavioral detail. Jenkins responded with restraint, but did not provide any specific evidence that could confirm his presence at the other site. The detective's notebook contains the following wording: "The alibi is not supported by any document or witness." After the interview, Vargas returned to the forestry office and requested more details about the routes that Black Mesa Logistics had laid out. In these records, he noted another important detail. The company was working in areas near technical trails that led close to the abandoned quarry. This meant that workers who had access to these routes could have known the paths to the places where the forensic experts found Paul's body. Vargas made a separate note in his memo about the need to reanalyze Jenkins's activities. He did not draw any direct conclusions, but noted that the presence of an old pickup truck, the use of industrial-strength paint, and work in inaccessible areas of the forest make this individual in need of further investigation. All of this information did not provide direct evidence, but it laid the groundwork for the next phase of work: to find out whether the activities of Black Mesa Lodge's employees could have overlapped with the route or location where Paul Reynolds was last seen. After the initial interview with Harry Jenkins, Detective Mark Vargas noted the need to verify every detail provided by the Black Mesa Logistics employee. He was most alarmed by the fact that Jenkins named a specific location where he was allegedly staying on the weekend when Paul Reynolds disappeared. According to the interviewee, he spent that period at the Coyote Hole Bar in Prescott, where he allegedly met with several acquaintances. He claimed to have been there on both Saturday and Sunday, returning home only late in the evening. There was no documentary evidence to support this, so Vargas sent an official request to the bar and neighboring establishments. The Coyote Hole did not have a permanent video surveillance system, but the Sagebrush Rest Motel across the street had street camera footage for several weeks. The motel administrator agreed to provide copies of the archive for review. It took several hours to review the material. The cameras recorded a section of the road in front of the motel and a part of the parking lot from which cars could be seen driving toward the forest trails. On the Saturday morning footage, Vargas saw a pickup truck that matched the description of Jenkins's car, an old Ford with dark door inserts. The footage clearly showed it leaving town in the early morning hours and heading toward a back road leading to sparsely populated areas of the national forest. The next day's footage showed the same pickup returning to the city after sunset. The recorded route corresponded to a time period that coincided with the period of Paul Reynolds' disappearance. In his report, Vargas noted, "The records contradict the claimed alibi. Presence in the city is not confirmed. Actual departure from the city was in the morning, return in the evening. The detective then summoned Jenkins to the department again. Vargas told him the results of the review, and the interviewee's behavior became noticeably tense. According to two officers who were present during the conversation, Jenkins was nervous, avoided making direct eye contact, and changed his position several times before agreeing to listen to the detective. When Vargas presented him with the printouts of the camera footage, Jenkins initially claimed that he was just driving out of town. However, his explanation was not consistent with the time or direction of travel. After that, he suddenly changed his strategy, mentioning that he was supposedly helping someone with car repairs. However, this version was not confirmed by his employers or acquaintances. Under pressure from the facts, according to the officer who wrote up the report, Jenkins changed his story several times without providing any credible explanation. Vargas gave him a pause for thought, after which he raised the possibility of opening criminal proceedings for perjury in a case of possible premeditated murder. After a short silence, Jenkins agreed to give a fuller version of the events. According to the detective, he spoke intermittently, as if choosing his words, but the content of his testimony was specific. He was not involved in the death of Paul Reynolds, but participated in what happened afterwards. According to him, during that period, he was not working in the city, but at a facility related to the construction of forest roads. It was there, according to him, that he first saw the body. Jenkins said his boss, the owner of Black Mesa Logistics, found the man's body in a remote part of the forest. When he realized that the situation could become a threat to the company, he ordered Harry to help him remove the body from the property. When asked why he didn't inform the police, Jenkins said he had no choice because he was threatened with dismissal and big trouble if he said too much. According to him, it was out of fear of losing his job and getting into conflict with his supervisor that he agreed to participate in the concealment of the body. The memo that Vargas attached to the case after the interview reads, "The interviewee claims that he was not involved in the victim's death, but confirms his participation in moving and hiding the body on the orders of his direct supervisor." The detective also recorded a behavioral detail. Throughout the second interview, Jenkins did not deny the fact that the body was discovered before the students found it in the quarry. His testimony was limited to the work in the woods and did not contain any information about the cause of Paul's death. By the time the interview was completed, a key question arose. If Paul's body had been found by the manager of Black Mesa Logistics at another location, he might know more about the circumstances of his death, as well as why the body had ended up in the quarry. Vargas put on the record the need to identify the person Jenkins called his boss and check all the sites where the company operated during the period of interest. The information about this person was the next step in the investigation. After Harry Jenkins's confession, Detective Mark Vargas checked the information about the head of Black Mesa Logistics. Roy McCoy was listed as the owner in the public registry. Vargas requested additional information from McCoy's personnel file, and the documents quickly revealed that this man could be a central figure in the whole story. According to the National Park Service archives, McCoy worked as a ranger in the Prescott National Forest more than a decade ago. He was fired after a series of disciplinary violations. His performance reviews mentioned excessive use of force and unacceptable behavior toward visitors. Several tourists filed complaints stating that McCoy intimidated them in remote areas, threatened them with fines, and decided issues at his own discretion. An internal investigation resulted in their dismissal without pay. The dossier also recorded that McCoy was born in Prescott and spent a lot of time in the woods since childhood. His former colleagues characterized him as a man who considered the forest his territory and reacted painfully to any intrusion by outsiders. The fact that he knew the area well and all the unofficial trails was undeniable. After obtaining this information, Vargas requested search warrants for McCoy's home, his office, and adjacent outbuildings. The judge, after reviewing Jenkins's testimony and McCoy's history, granted the warrant. The search began at dawn. McCoy's house was a small one-story cottage on the territory of an outdated technical camp where road crews used to live. The garage stood alone. The door was locked but damaged on one of the hinges, as if it had been forced open. Inside the garage, detectives found an old dark-colored Ford SUV. The car was in poor condition. There was a layer of dried dust on the bottom, scratches on the rear door, and a dent in the front bumper. The marks on the metal were not chaotic. The dent had a shape characteristic of an impact with a solid object of medium height. In the report, the experts noted, "The damage is not of a domestic nature. Probably a blow against something that had a static base." Several rolls of tarpaulin, ropes, and plastic ties were found in the luggage compartment. One of the tarpaulins had dark-colored spots on it, but experts could not tell on the spot whether it was paint or traces of organic origin. Everything was seized for analysis. McCoy's office was of particular interest. It contained an old computer with an external hard disk. At first glance, it was a working tool for keeping records of equipment and routes. However, while reviewing the files, forensic experts found archives of GPS tracks that were not related to official company projects. The tracks were grouped by year. Vargas asked the forensic experts to review the records for the year of Paul Reynolds's disappearance. Among dozens of route files, they found one dated October. It started from a technical trail near the lower approaches to Granite Mountain, then led deeper into the forest, far from official hiking routes. According to GPS data, the route ended in a remote area that was not marked on standard maps. A few minutes later, the track would start again, as if the driver had stopped the car, turned off the device, and then reactivated it. The new segment led in the opposite direction, to a quarry near Sailor Springs. The official report contains a statement that became crucial. The GPS route covers 2 points, a remote segment of forest and the quarry where Paul Reynolds's remains were found. The movement indicates a possible transportation of the body. While experts were analyzing the equipment, Vargas interviewed McCoy's neighbors. One of them claimed to have heard the sound of an old SUV driving off toward the woods at night, without headlights. Another recalled seeing McCoy returning covered in dust, as if he had been working on heavy machinery, although no official work was being done at the time. All of this information did not constitute direct evidence, but it created a picture in which McCoy could have been the last person to see Paul alive. Moreover, his knowledge of hidden areas of the forest and technical trails coincided with the route recorded in the GPS files. Vargas seized the computer, SUV, tarp, and ropes as physical evidence. In the report, he noted that the suspect's actions indicate knowledge of the area, technical skills, and the ability to hide tracks in a way that would make the search more difficult. This became the basis for further investigative actions and a reassessment of the events of that October period. All the findings pointed to McCoy being in the woods at the same time as Paul Reynolds disappeared. And most importantly, his own device preserved a route that started from a remote point and ended where the body was found years later. After a search of Roy McCoy's home and office, Detective Mark Vargas initiated a formal arrest for questioning. McCoy agreed to come in voluntarily, appearing at the station in work clothes as if he had been called in for a routine maintenance check. He remained calm, spoke little, and responded to Vargas's first questions with ostentatious indifference. The interrogation report states, "The interviewee states that he has no relation to Paul Reynolds and was not in the forest during the period of his disappearance. However, he was unable to explain why his GPS tracks contained routes to the same region where Reynolds's phone activity was last recorded." When Vargas recited the data from the computer, a route dated October that began at the lower approaches to Granite Mountain and ended at an abandoned quarry, McCoy's demeanor changed. According to an officer present during the interrogation, he stopped making eye contact and asked several times where they got this information. This was the first sign that the working mask was starting to crack. The second blow came from Harry Jenkins's testimony. Vargas did not read them verbatim, but in general terms told McCoy that one of his employees had admitted to participating in moving the bodies on his orders. Roy raised his head sharply and said that this guy is just trying to take the blame. But the fact that he did not deny the very existence of the situation with the body was immediately noted by the detectives. Vargas gave him a few minutes of silence. After this pause, an entry appeared in the protocol. The interviewee changed his behavior. His face turned pale. His hands were trembling. When he spoke again, his voice was lower and tense. According to the version he gave during the official interrogation, it all started when he was working in a remote part of the forest, checking areas for technical passage. There, he allegedly saw an unknown man sawing a tree without any permission. McCoy admitted that a conflict arose between the two. According to him, he tried to scare the offender by bringing his SUV closer to him at high speed. Further, the protocol records McCoy's statement. "I didn't want to kill him. He took a step back, slipped. I didn't have time to slow down." Experts could not confirm this particular detail, but they had already established that the death was traumatic. Hitting a bumper or hard surface, the victim could have sustained injuries incompatible with life. McCoy claimed that he panicked after the incident. According to him, he decided to hide the body in a deeper area of the forest so that no one would see the consequences of the accident. He wrapped the body in an awning he kept in his car and moved it to a remote forest area where, he said, no one ever goes. This point coincided with the chronology previously suggested by forensic scientists, a long period during which the body was in a place other than the quarry. Regarding Jenkins's involvement, McCoy explained that the Forest Service was planning to start planting in the area where he left the body. He was afraid that the contractors would accidentally stumble upon the remains, so, in his words, "I asked Harry to help move them." He described the process briefly. They used a tarp, loaded it into an SUV, and drove it to an abandoned quarry where, according to McCoy, no one ever shows up. At this point, he began to deny certain details, trying to avoid direct wording, but the general pattern of events had already been laid out. Vargas's official summary reads, "The interviewee recognizes the fact of moving the body and contact with the victim on the eve of death. The nature of the actions after the alleged incident indicates a deliberate concealment of the event." Several phrases in the report are repeated in the testimony of other people who once worked with Maka. He often spoke of the forest as a place that needs to be kept in order. This was not direct evidence, but it reflected a certain way of thinking, a desire to control the territory, to react aggressively to those he perceived as intruders. Experts confirmed that his SUV had damage commensurate with hitting a person, and the paint particles on Paul's bones matched the composition of the coating found on the front bumper. Together with the GPS tracks, this brought McCoy's version of events into a coherent sequence. The case was officially categorized as unintentional manslaughter, aggravated by the deliberate concealment of the body. The final report stated that McCoy's actions after the incident were deliberate, prolonged, and beyond the behavior of a person who is simply panicking. Paul Reynolds's family was notified of the results of the investigation. According to the officer who transmitted the message, they did not request public comment and only asked for copies of the case file. In the following days, they were given the opportunity to bury Paul according to family tradition. The final official document, which Vargas added to the archive, stated, "Death was caused by a single traumatic contact. Further actions of the person at the scene were aimed at concealing the fact of death. It was determined that the incident was the result of a combination of conflict, negligence, and intentional post facto actions." The Prescott National Forest has received another story in which the truth has long remained hidden in remote areas, where only the locals know all the trails, and every mistake can cost lives.